What is going on, everybody? In today's video, we're going to be breaking down my top 50 wide receivers rankings and tiers as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. So I'll be going through each and every single wide receiver that ranks in the top 50 for me. You guys know exactly what to expect, and the fantasy season is swiftly approaching, so make sure you guys are paying close attention. If you are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you're into that, be sure to subscribe on the way in. We are putting out daily fantasy football content to help you guys prepare for the upcoming 2025 fantasy football season. So let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video. All right, let's start with the first overall tier. This is just going to be those first round undisputed GOATs as we approach the upcoming season. These are the guys that we don't need to spend a lot of time on. We will talk a little bit about Malik Nabers because he does make this tier for me. But in terms of my top 4 overall wide receivers at this point in the offseason, I've got Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, and Malik Nabers. We look at Jamar Chase coming off of a wide receiver 1 finish in 2024, has been the wide receiver 12 or better in each of his first 4 seasons, has not ranked inside the top 5 outside of last year since his rookie season. But what we do know here is that the volume in terms of the passing game should not change whatsoever for the Bengals, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and company in 2025. Look, at the end of the day, this defense doesn't look much better than last year. Jamar Chase had 175 targets last year, 127 catches, over 1,700 receiving yards, 13.4 yards per catch, and 17 receiving touchdowns. He did not give you anything else but double-digit fantasy performances last year in full PPR, except for week 2 against Kansas City. The ceiling's way too high here, but also the floor is incredibly safe. Jamar Chase has got to be number 1. Then I've still got Justin Jefferson as number 2. This was your wide receiver 2 last year in full PPR, so not a huge surprise here with the first 2 players. JJ last year, 154 targets, 103 catches, over 1,500 receiving yards, 14.8 yards per catch, and 10 receiving touchdowns. This is another player who gave you double-digit fantasy performances every single week last year except for 2 games. So absolutely balled out last year. Very safe floor, very high ceiling with JJ. And once again, this Kevin O'Connell offensive system is made to throw the football, and the vocal point of that is JJ. Some people a little bit worried here because they're not as high on the other JJ McCarthy, the sophomore quarterback who will be the starting quarterback presumably for the Vikings this upcoming season. But once again, this offensive system is very friendly to quarterbacks, and Sam Darnold was able to run it last year. So I've got no fear about JJ whatsoever. He comes in at number 2 here. Then moving along, I do have CeeDee Lamb as my wide receiver 3, which, depending on how you look at some rankings and ADPs out there, Lamb can be a little bit all over the place, but I think a lot of people agree that he should be the wide receiver 3 going into next season, because last year was a bit of a write-off year because Dak Prescott was, injured early in the season in week 9 against the Atlanta Falcons. And overall, the offensive attack just wasn't the same through the air, but we know, in 2022, CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 5. In 2023, he was the wide receiver 1, and Dallas had one of the very best passing attacks in the entire league. And, they don't even have to get back to that necessary standard, but they will, as long as they get close, then we're in good fortune when it comes to CeeDee Lamb. And on top of all that, even with, just a few games played with Dak Prescott last year, CeeDee Lamb still finished as the wide receiver 8 in full PPR, 152 targets, 101 receptions, over 1,100 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. An absolutely monster year for CeeDee Lamb. What was really impressive last year in terms of CeeDee Lamb was the fact that, with Cooper Rush at quarterback, amongst several injuries to CeeDee Lamb, right? We still saw CeeDee Lamb continue to ball out. Plus, he got paid last offseason, right? So there's not necessarily any reason for CeeDee Lamb to be on the field if he truly wanted to have a cop-out due to some of those injuries and, quarterback play and all that stuff. And he still showed up for your fantasy football squads, averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game and finishing as the wide receiver 7 in fantasy points per game last year. So I'm all in on CeeDee Lamb here. I think he deserves to undisputedly be going at the top of the first round. And then last but not least in this tier, we have Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. This is a player who I think, in a lot of rankings will probably come in the next tier, but I think it's really easy when we look at the next couple wide receivers who go in the first round to kind of have a guy that you think should should be in this top tier, whether it's Malik Neighbors, Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins, and even Brian Thomas Jr., right? All these guys are going to have monster seasons this year. But for me, Malik Neighbors finishing as the wide receiver 6 last year, 170 targets, 109 catches, over 1,200 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, a monster rookie campaign with just one single-digit fantasy performance last year. You go on Player Profiler, they have a stat that they track that is Dominator rating, and Malik Neighbors was number 1 amongst all wide receivers in that metric. That is a receiver's percentage of total team receiving yards and team receiving touchdowns. He is the vocal point of this Giants offense. That's not going to change in 2025. Last year, he was number 1 in target share amongst all wide receivers, number 2 in targets, and number 2 in target rate amongst all wide receivers. And we're going to get better quarterback play, presumably out of Russell Wilson, Jackson Dart, or maybe a sprinkle of Jameis Winston in 2025, but we should expect better quarterback play here, even if these guys aren't superstar quarterbacks. So when I'm in the first round, mid-first round, the wide receiver that I find myself confidently drafting the most, who is not one of these top tier guys that you're used to hearing, and who is, maybe in this next tier for a lot of people, is Malik Neighbors. I'm all in on Neighbors as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. All right, let's move along to the second tier here, and I would kind of describe this tier as like very solid wide receiver ones who could easily break into the last tier that we just went over. I'd be completely fine coming out of my drafts with any of these guys as my wide receiver ones. They may not be as top as the other guys you see, but I certainly think that they could be. When you look at Puka Nacua, who comes in first here, I think this is, for a lot of people, the next wide receiver taken off the board, maybe after CeeDee Lamb, JJ, and Jamar Chase. Was the wide receiver 2 in terms of fantasy points per game last year with 18.8 fantasy points per game, 106 targets, 79 catches, 990 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. Wide receiver 26 playing through just 11 games after having a wide receiver 4 finish in PPR in 2023. And that's the big thing with Puka Nacua is, like, obviously you look at things here, if we add in the games that he could have played in if he wasn't injured, then we're probably looking at a much higher ranked wide receiver. So I have no problem whatsoever if you consider Puka Nacua a little bit higher than maybe a Malik Neighbors per se, right? I think Puka is going to absolutely ball out. I really love this tier of wide receivers. I think they're all absolute studs. I don't think anyone dislikes this tier of wide receivers. Once again, tied to Matthew Stafford, tied to a great offensive system under Sean McVay. So there's nothing to dislike about Puka Nacua whatsoever. I think he could easily be in that GOAT tier as long as he is healthy this year, fully healthy throughout the entirety of the season. He's going to have an absolute monster fantasy season. So all in on Puka Nacua, just comes in a little bit lower for me in the tier number 1 overall. Then we got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's been the wide receiver 3 in full PPR 2 years in a row. And if you guys have followed the channel for the past couple years, you guys know that I'm a long time Amon-Ra St. Brown truther. And there are some, concerns, not for me, but some concerns out there about this new offensive system with no Ben Johnson. What is this offense going to look like? All that stuff. I'm not worried about it whatsoever. This is another player. The floor is so incredibly safe with Amon-Ra St. Brown, tied to Jared Goff once again. So we know what to expect here. We know he's the undisputed wide receiver 1 on this team. Some volume in the passing game will go to Jahmyr Gibbs, will go to Sam Laporta, will go to Jamison Williams. But at the end of the day, this offense's heartbeat after the run game is Amon-Ra St. Brown. When it comes to the passing game, first and foremost, he is the target. The wide receiver 4 in fantasy points per game 2 years in a row. Last year, 18.6 fantasy points per game in another monstrous season. 141 targets, 115 catches, over 1,200 receiving yards, 12 receiving touchdowns. This is another player. If you own him, you got nothing to worry about whatsoever. Only 2 single-digit fantasy performances last year. Nothing to dislike about going out and getting Amon-Ra as your wide receiver 1 going into next year. Then to wrap up this tier, we got 2 wide receivers left. Nico Collins is the other player here who I think you'll look at kind of similar to Puka Nacua. We add in the games that he missed last year, played in 12 games last year, and probably looking at a top 10 wide receiver easily in terms of PPR points scored last year. And don't forget, he was on an absolute tear through the first 5 weeks of the season with 12.6 or more fantasy points in all 5 of those games, 27.5 or more fantasy points in 2 of those games. Even in the game that he got hurt, week 5 against Buffalo, he only had 2 catches, 2 targets, 78 receiving yards, and a touchdown. once again here, he is tied to tied to CJ Stroud. We know what to expect here. He's the vocal point of this passing attack. There's no Stephon Diggs here. Tank Dell not going to play this year, more than likely. We're looking at 2 rookie wide receivers and Christian Kirk coming in terms of potential targets being taken away, but I'm just not worried about any of that whatsoever. I don't think anybody is. There's a huge amount of upside when you guys draft Nico Collins. Finished as the wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game last year with 17.6 and was the wide receiver 7 in fantasy points per game in 2023. Nico Collins, one of the players in terms of ADP right now, I just am absolutely smashing the draft button on almost every single time. And the same goes for Brian Thomas Jr. You know, you're getting extreme values at the end of the first round, sometimes bleeding into the beginning of the second round when we look at names like Nico Collins and Brian Thomas Jr. And I've talked about Brian Thomas Jr. a lot throughout the offseason, and he is a player that I'm absolutely bullish on as we approach the upcoming fantasy season. 4 single-digit fantasy games last year. Outside of that, double-digit fantasy performances in every other game with very mediocre quarterback play, right? A lot of Mac Jones after Trevor Lawrence got hurt, and he was still the wide receiver 4 and full PPR last year with over 1,200 receiving yards, 133 targets, 87 catches, 10 receiving touchdowns. Some of his advanced metrics last year were absolutely crazy. He was number 5 in deep targets, number 3 in total receiving yards, number 4 in yards after catch, number 6 in unrealized air yards, which is definitely tied to the fact that he had poor quarterback play for a lot of the year, including number 8 in total air yards, was number 5 in total touchdowns last year. And if we look back to that dominator rating ranking that we talked about with Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr. was number 2, Neighbors number 1, D-Tom number 2 in that rating, a receiver's percentage of total team receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. So obviously the heartbeat of this offense. Yes, Travis Hunter is on this team now. The Jags spent a lot of draft capital to trade up and select him. But at the end of the day, you look at the Liam Cohen offense last year that the Buccaneers ran. All the wide receivers in that offense ate. Both the running backs ate. Kate Otten, a tight end, ate at times too. I'm not worried about it here. This is the focal point of the passing attack for the Jags. I'm absolutely bullish on his overall ADP right now, and I'm smashing the draft button whenever Brian Thomas Jr. is available. So he wraps up the first overall tier for our 2025 fantasy football wide receiver rankings. Let's move along to the second tier. And once again here, these are going to be very solid wide receiver ones. You maybe carry just a little bit more risk than the wide receivers in the first tier, and maybe a little bit less overall upside than the wide receivers in the first tier, as well as that GOAT tier that we talked about. But I still love all these wide receivers, find myself drafting a lot of these guys. And then once again, throughout the course of this video, right, and throughout the course of any ranking and tier videos that we'll do, we're going to start talking a little bit about ADP, right, and how, you know, I might be drafting certain players based on their ADP or more bullish on them based on their ADP than players ranked higher than them. So we'll get into that as the video goes on, but let's start things off with Drake London, who had a very, good, I would say, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, breakout season in 2024, going from the wide receiver 31 in 2022, the wide receiver 37 in 2023, to the wide receiver 5 in 2024 in full PPR. 158 targets, 100 catches, over 1,200 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, was the wide receiver 13 in fantasy points per game with 16.5. And a lot of that, of course, is absolutely baked into the fact that he had good quarterback play. Not fantastic quarterback play, but much better quarterback play than he has had in his first 2 seasons in the league. And then now, of course, we're going to get a full season out of Michael Penix. Everyone's excited here. There's a lot of hype around this offense. We saw 3 starts out of Penix last year, 2 in the fantasy season. In those 2 that came during the fantasy season, Drake London had 10.9 fantasy points and 17.6. Then in week 18, in a good old NFC South shootout that was completely meaningless between the Panthers and the Falcons, Michael Penix had his best performance of his rookie campaign, and Drake London had 40.7 fantasy points, 18 targets, 10 catches, 187 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. But this is another player who the advanced metrics are very good on. Number 3 in total targets last year, number 6 in target share, number 3 in target rate. And I don't expect any of that to change. The volume should all be there for London in this 4th season. Number 3 in air yards, number 7 in total receptions, number 4 in total receiving yards, number 9 in total touchdowns, right? So also number 7 in dominator rating. So once again, this is a player who he is the heartbeat of the passing attack here. We will get some Darnell Mooney involved here, and I do like Darnell Mooney. And I don't know, maybe Kyle Pitts is still on this team to start the year, and maybe this is the Kyle Pitts year. We will save that for another video. But and Bijan Robinson will get some volume in the passing game. But at the end of the day, this is the focal point of the passing attack. Should get much better quarterback play this year. All in on Drake London at his current ADP. Love him coming into the beginning of the second round right now. I also absolutely love A.J. Brown, a player that I've talked a lot about in this current offseason. I think the A.J. Brown hate has gone way, way too far. A.J. Brown, one of the most productive fantasy football wide receivers over the last 3 seasons, and especially in the 2 previous seasons before this 2024 campaign. He was the wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game in 2022. He was also the wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game in 2023 and finished as the wide receiver 6 and the wide receiver 5 in those respective years. Only played through 13 games last year, finished as the wide receiver 20 and the wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game at 16.7, having 97 targets, 67 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. He's had over 1,000 receiving yards and 7 or more touchdowns 3 seasons in a row. And you look back, I remember last year, start, sit, videos, questions, fantasy Q&A, all that good stuff that we're getting very excited is going to be starting up again soon. I had a lot of questions consistently about A.J. Brown, like, should I start this player over A.J. Brown? Whatever, right? And my answer is always, you start A.J. Brown, no matter what. He only gave you guys single-digit fantasy performances twice last year. And I know the Eagles ran the football a ton last year. And I know some people worried about that going into this year, but they still threw enough to keep A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith involved. And I think you could easily argue here that in terms of Saquon Barkley, maybe they ran too much, and maybe they'll run a little bit less this year and get guys like A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith a little bit more included. So A.J. Brown not moving down in rankings for me whatsoever. And I think in terms of value, I am absolutely okay walking out of drafts right now with A.J. Brown as my wide receiver 1. Let's move along to Ladd McConkey, the next player in terms of rankings here. Who's another player that I feel really good about at that turn going into the beginning of the second round. Finished as the wide receiver 13 in full PPR in his rookie season, 112 targets, 82 catches, over 1,100 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns. Now, this passing attack for the Chargers didn't really get clicking till about, between week 6 and week 8, but week 8 was really the big game, right? Against the New Orleans Saints, where things really started to get rolling, and we had that breakout game, so to speak, for Ladd McConkey, who did have 2 very good performances between weeks 1 and 4, but week 8, 6 targets, 6 catches, 111 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. After that game, he only gave you single-digit fantasy performances once. Okay. And you look at some of the advanced metrics for Ladd McConkey. I talked a lot about these in a recent video I did talking about 5 wide receivers that I think could break the 2025 fantasy football season. The advanced metrics for Ladd McConkey are very good across the board, and he finished as the wide receiver 16 in terms of fantasy points per game. He's tied to Justin Herbert, and a big thing here too, Justin Herbert went into the beginning of last season injured, got a little banged up early in the season as well. And this is still an offensive system that can, look at things and run the football first and play defense. But I think like we saw kind of down the stretch last year for the Chargers, we'll see that passing attack open up a bit more as we come into the 2025 season. So I know there's a lot of hype out there about Ladd McConkey as we approach this upcoming season, and I'm all in for it. I think where he's going in drafts, he's an absolute bargain. I would be perfectly fine with him as my wide receiver 1 going into 2025. And next up, we've got Jackson Smith in Jigba, who a little bit earlier in the offseason was being a little bit more aggressively drafted, and now I've seen him move back in terms of ADP a little bit, but I'm still all in on Jackson Smith and Jigba going into 2025. Once again, this is a player who had very good advanced metrics last year, ran the most slot snaps of any wide receiver last year, ran the 6th most routes in total out of any wide receiver last year, was 12th in total targets, number 7 in receptions, number 7 in yards after catch last year, number 7 in juke juke rate. I mean, there's a lot to like about what we saw out of Jackson Smith and Jigba in 2024. And now we go into 2025 with no DK Metcalf on this team, no Tyler Lockett. Yes, I know there's Cooper Kupp on this team, but I'm not incredibly worried about that. And I know we get a change at quarterback here going from Geno Smith to Sam Darnold, but Sam Darnold was able to feed both JJ and Jordan Addison last year. And I think that ultimately this is a run-first offense that'll get a lot of volume in the passing game too. Kenneth Walker and potentially Zach Charbonnet as well. But at the end of the day, this is the heartbeat of this offense. Jackson Smith and Jigba is in line for a ton of volume, and there's nobody really here to get in front of him and leave you concerned. Once again here, a wide receiver who gave you single-digit fantasy performances just 4 times last year. For me, all in on Jackson Smith and Jigba, I'm completely fine with finishing a fantasy draft where he is my wide receiver 1. No problem with it whatsoever. Next up, we've got T. Higgins, who I just have a tough time ranking lower here. And I do think for me, like, he's the one player in this tier who I'm not like insanely happy if he's my wide receiver 1. You know, if I go starting my draft with 2 running backs, I'm okay with T. Higgins. I do kind of prefer him as a wide receiver 2, but he still makes this tier because the upside is way too high. And he's one of these players when he's on the board, you know, in the 3rd round, I just find myself drafting him every single time because the upside is way too high. The wide receiver 5 in fantasy points per game last year with 18.5 fantasy points per game. I get the knock here. Only played in 12 games in the past 2 seasons, and then he got paid this offseason, but I don't think he's going to like filter out or anything here crazy. This is the same offense like we talked about with Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, quarterback. And it's a good thing that Jamar Chase is on the field because that leaves a lot of big plays and opportunities for T. Higgins because the defensive pressure goes to Jamar Chase. Defense is still bad here. This is a team that's going to throw the football as much as any team in the league. We saw that last year. T. Higgins, I just have a tough time not ranking him this high. The upside, kind of the maybe potential for some injury or some ups and downs, does, like I said, make me kind of prefer him as a wide receiver 2, but I still think he belongs in this tier because the passing volume for the Bengals is way too high. And the upside, once again, way too high to pass on. Next up, we've got Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. And this is a player who I've seen a lot of hate about Garrett Wilson. And listen, as you guys know, if you follow the channel this offseason, I'm all in on Garrett Wilson going into 2025. I absolutely love him at his current ADP, coming off of his most productive fantasy season yet in 2024, finishing as the wide receiver 10 in full PPR, 154 targets, 101 receptions, 7 receiving touchdowns, over 1,100 receiving yards. The wide receiver 18 in fantasy points per game with 14.8 fantasy points per game. Was number 4 in total targets, number 1 in snap share last year, number 3 in total routes ran, number 6 in route participation, number 5 in total receptions. And once again, I mean, that is all with Davante Adams like crashing the party second half of the season, right? And now Davante Adams not on this team. Then we look at the makeup of this Jets roster. It's Josh Reynolds, Alan Lazard, rookie Mason Taylor at tight end. Breece Hall will get some volume in this passing game, sure, but there's just nobody here to really steal volume away. I know that, Justin Fields makes some people feel shaky, but a lot of people brought up, the comparisons with Justin Fields and DJ Moore just a few years ago and how productive DJ Moore was, having his best fantasy finish ever just 2 seasons ago. And I think we could easily see that where last year with the Steelers, they kind of kept Justin Fields in a box and just were waiting around for Russell Wilson to get back. So I like this Jets offense for fantasy purposes going into 2025, and I'm all in on Garrett Wilson. I think he's a very solid wide receiver 1 who you get at a very good price right now in terms of ADP. Next up, we've got Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. This is a tough evaluation for a lot of people, I feel like, but I also feel like there are a lot more people high on Rashee Rice than low on Rashee Rice, right? 16.2 fantasy points per game last year through basically 3 games, but technically 4 games. And those first 3 games before Patrick Mahomes ruined his knee for the year, 17.3 fantasy points, 18.5, 29.1. And if you guys remember in 2023, I was really high on Rashee Rice, and that definitely paid off in the second half of the season last year. Listen, there's not a lot to talk about here, right? Doesn't look like we're going to see him face a suspension for the off-field stuff in 2025, and it looks like he's going to be fully healthy to start the season. So we're baking in what he did in his rookie season, especially the second half, bleeding in to the Super Bowl and the playoffs. And then we're looking at what he did at the beginning of last season. I do think he's more consistent than Xavier Worthy will potentially be. I do like Xavier Worthy still, and I do think that Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Travis Kelce, Noah Gray, Isaiah Pacheco, I think all these guys will be better than what we saw last year. I think there's going to be less injuries, better offensive line play. Chiefs will be a little bit more fantasy relevant again, at least comparison to last year. So I'm in on Rashee Rice. Don't get me wrong. If you're a little bit worried, you might have him a little bit lower because of, coming off an injury or off the field stuff still bothering you, or there's other options on this offense. But I talk about the same thing with Xavier Worthy. I think it's good that we're going to get Rice, Worthy, Hollywood all on the field at the same time. We'll allow these guys to play to their strengths and do what they do best. So Rashee Rice, I'm in on him. It's a little bit of a steep ADP, I think some people think, but I'm completely fine with it. Be perfectly okay with considering him a wide receiver 1 going into 2025. Moving to tier 3, and I would consider this players that I prefer as wide receiver 2s. Could have wide receiver 1 value, don't get me wrong, but generally speaking, I'm going to prefer to draft these guys as wide receiver 2s. Some of them overall have a little bit more upside than others. Some have some risk factor involved. So let's start with Mike Evans, who I think, once again, the risk factor here is what it is every single year. He's a little bit older, right? But he seems to find a way to get it done every single year, no matter what, right? I mean, you look back since 2020, he's been the wide receiver 17 or better in every season, the wide receiver 14 or better in all those except for 1, the wide receiver 11 or better in all those except for 2. He's had over 1,000 receiving yards in every year of his career. He's had over 1,000 receiving yards and 5 or more receiving touchdowns in every year of his career, except for 1. He goes in 2025 at age 31, going into his 12th season in the league. But this Buccaneers offense, man, they're going to throw the football a ton this year. Baker Mayfield's coming off of an MVP caliber type season. Mike Evans has been the wide receiver 10 in fantasy points per game in 2 seasons in a row. Over 1,000 receiving yards last year, 110 targets, 74 catches, 11 receiving touchdowns. The only knock here is that he's a little bit older, but I'll say at his ADP right now, he's generally a smash draft selection. Not a whole lot to worry about here. The consistency will be there. The floor will be there. It's just the age that worries some. Next up, we got scary Terry McLaurin. I'll go ahead and say, I know like the contract situation seems bad right now, but that tends to happen with these star players. You're trying to get paid. And I do personally believe that Terry McLaurin will be back with the Commanders. So this is basically the same type of situation here. Still much younger than Mike Evans, but the only knock here is that Terry McLaurin, a little bit older than some of the other wide receivers you see on the board, which associates some risk factor, right? But Terry McLaurin is coming off of his best season fantasy-wise of his entire career. Was the wide receiver 7 last year in full PPR, 117 targets, 82 receptions, just under 1,100 receiving yards, 13 receiving touchdowns. That was something we were really missing from Terry McLaurin's career, was receiving touchdowns. He had 7 his rookie season, but outside of that, 5 or less every other single season. And all that's baked into poor quarterback play, which we know now he has good quarterback play. Wide receiver 14 in fantasy points per game. Terry McLaurin had a monster season last year, and I think without like the contract stuff floating around, and maybe if he's a little bit younger, he would undisputedly be much higher in these overall rankings. So I still really like Terry McLaurin, and he's similar to Mike Evans here, where like he could be one of the best overall values in terms of guys who you're drafting. You prefer them as wide receiver 2s, but they could easily, undoubtedly be in wide receiver 1 territory. Moving along, we got another veteran, that is Davante Adams, who is now with the LA Rams and a very pass-happy system under Matt Stafford and Sean McVay at head coach. And we saw once Adams went to the Jets last year, and he was, completely targeted by Aaron Rodgers. He absolutely balled out. I mean, it was looking like a very disappointing season if you owned Davante Adams, but he ended up finishing as the wide receiver 11, 141 targets, 85 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. I don't necessarily know what the volume is going to look like here. It's going to be Puka Nacua number 1 overall in that offense for sure. And Adams coming off a season where he had the 9th most fantasy points per game at 17.2. But, he's had 8 or more receiving touchdowns in 3 straight seasons. And I think Puka Nacua being on the field will really allow for a lot of red zone looks for Devontae Adams. So still really bullish on him at his ADP. I prefer him as a wide receiver too, because I think ultimately volume is wide receiver 2-esque, but the red zone upside is really high. And once again, good quarterback, good offensive system. Really like where Adams is going in draft, so I've got him right here in this third tier. And then next up, we got Tyreek Hill. Now, I've seen Tyreek Hill's ADP all over the place currently. A lot of different opinions about Tyreek Hill at this point in the offseason. And I will say, I don't think it's all doom and gloom and over for Tyreek Hill as we approach 2025. And we still got some productive games out of him last year, but he dropped from the wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game to the wide receiver 29. And he played in 17 games last year. Okay. Listen, I know Tua Tagovailoa did miss time last year, only playing in 11 total games, which is obviously a factor here, but also it didn't just feel like Hill lost a step. It felt like the offense as a whole and the team as a whole, their spirit lost a step last year. But I still think he'll have plenty of productive fantasy finishes this year. Could easily see him finishing in the top 25 once again at the wide receiver position, if not the top 20. Last year he's a wide receiver 18. So you look at things: 123 targets, 81 catches, 959 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, and then there's still been some looming injuries. Looming injuries were a thing all of last year. Then there's been off the field stuff it's just one of these things where there's a lot of reasons to feel negative, but I think ultimately in terms of fantasy production, it'll be there. Some people have him higher. I think he's appropriately ranked right here in this kind of middle of the third tier. Next up, we got Courtland Sutton. So a lot of veterans in this tier. And I really like Courtland Sutton, who finished as the wide receiver 15 full PPR last year. This is one of my deep sleepers. If you guys go back to last offseason, 135 targets, 81 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. And I think that this offense under Sean Payton and Bo Nix at quarterback will take another step forward with Bo Nix in his sophomore season. So I think Sutton is being appropriately drafted. Was he wide receiver 14 in fantasy points per game last year, number 24 overall in fantasy points per game last year. But I just don't know how much upside there is here. I could see a very similar finish to last year. I also think guys like Marvin Mims and potentially Pat Bryant, as well as Evan Ingram, better running back play at RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins will take away some of the volume that Courtland Sutton saw last year. So I worry about that as well. But I think he'll be very consistent. I think he's worth his ADP right now. Just don't know how high the upside is. Next up, we've got Marvin Harrison Jr., who is a player that I actually really like, and I consider ranking a bit higher. And I will say, baked in at his ADP, I draft a lot of Marvin Harrison Jr. I think in terms of having a better sophomore season, he could absolutely do so. The Cardinals just did not use him for the majority of the season the correct way last year, but we still saw plenty of good flashes. It just felt like a big disappointment because this was a player that you drafted into the first round, beginning of the second round going into last year. Was he wide receiver 30, 116 targets, 62 receptions, 885 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, wide receiver 39 in fantasy points per game at 11.6. But I believe in a sophomore step forward for Marvin Harrison Jr., still tied to a good quarterback. I know everyone hates on Kyler, but still tied to what I think will be enough consistency that Marvin Harrison Jr. can be very productive in his sophomore season. So I like him right here at the end of the third tier. Then we got my boy, Devonta Smith, who might be a little bit higher ranked for some people's taste, but I am always in on Devonta Smith each and every year. Another player who I find myself consistently ranting about has been wide receiver 20 or better in fantasy points per game in 3 straight seasons. Was the wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game last year. Has been a wide receiver 29 or better in 4 straight seasons. Only played in 13 games last year. Was the wide receiver 27, 833 receiving yards, 89 targets, 68 catches, 8 receiving touchdowns. This was another player who I will get a lot of questions about in full PPR. I told you guys, no matter what, you always start Devonta Smith, and he does seem to always have a couple really goose egg type games, 1 or 2 every single season, and they do pain you. But outside of that, he only had 3 single-digit fantasy games last year. Every other game was a double-digit fantasy performance. Very safe flex option. very, very safe floor with Devonta Smith, and the ceiling is still there at times, like we saw in the fantasy championship last year, finishing with 30 fantasy points in week 17. And once again, I know this offense ran a lot last year. I'm not worried about it. They still threw enough, and it's still A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert. Nobody else really here, unless you're including the passing volume to Saquon Barkley, right? In terms of wide receivers, it's A.J. Brown, it's Devonta Smith, and that's it. So I still have him ranked in the third overall tier as we approach 2025. Moving along into tier number 4, I would say low end wide receiver 2s and plenty of guys with very solid flex value. Let's start with DJ Moore, who for me barely misses tier 3. I'm actually, pretty high on DJ Moore. It feels like every offseason. And I just feel like kind of the drop from wide receiver 6 to wide receiver 16 with Caleb Williams in his rookie season was a little bit alarming. And then the combination of what exactly is this offense going to look like under Ben Johnson also dropped from the wide receiver 9 in fantasy points per game to the wide receiver 26 in fantasy points per game, finishing with 966 receiving yards off of 140 targets, 98 catches, 6 receiving touchdowns. But I don't want to panic too much here. I think volume's going to go to Roma Dunze. I think there's going to be some stuff drawn up for Luther Burden. Obviously, Colston Loveland, they spent high draft capital on. I still think DeAndre Swift is the RB1 in that backfield, right? But I'm trying not to panic too much here. I just think, once again, this is another player with a really safe floor. But what's the upside here? Because I do think there's an argument that DJ Moore could see Amon-Ra St. Brown type volume, but then there's an argument that Roma Dunze fits that role a little bit better. And then there's just we just don't really know. So I think he's being drafted appropriately, and he could easily slide into the tier 3 here, but there's a little bit of an unknown here, and that concerns me. So a little bit more risk. He's a lower end wide receiver 2 for me, but he could finish higher, and I wouldn't be surprised. Now, I got Calvin Ridley pretty high here. I am pretty dang high on Calvin Ridley going into 2025. And if you guys have been following the channel this offseason, I talked a lot about Calvin Ridley, who finished number 1 in air yards last year. Okay. Number 1 overall because he had awful quarterback play from the mailman, Will Levis. And our guy, Mason Rudolph, also was number 1 in unrealized air yards. Those will improve, even if it's Cam Ward. Okay, I know not everyone is a Cam Ward truther. And listen, there could definitely be some growing pains with Cam Ward as a rookie quarterback, but it should be better this year. And still, Calvin Ridley's not being drafted like a top 30 wide receiver like he was last year. He was a wide receiver 18 in 2023 with Jacksonville, wide receiver 28 last year. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 120 targets, 64 catches, 4 receiving touchdowns. I like Ridley. I think a couple of the next guys we'll go over might have more upside. Maybe you're funner flex options who have higher ceilings. But in terms of a wide receiver 1, I think Calvin Ridley is a low end wide receiver 1 who you prefer to draft as a low end wide receiver 2 for your fantasy teams. So I like Ridley quite a bit, and we'll leave it at that. Next up, we've got Jameson Williams, a player that I really like going into 2025, who I've drafted a lot of, talked a lot about this offseason. This is a guy who there's going to be some bumps in the roads. It's going to be a bit up and down. This is one of my sleepers last offseason that we talked about a lot. And this is another player who there's kind of this concern because Ben Johnson's gone from the Lions, and what are we going to get here? But all the signs are pointing towards a lot of usage under new offensive coordinator John Morton, who's raved about Jameson Williams. This is an upside pick, right? And he's still finished with over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, wide receiver 22 last year. And I just like Jameson Williams. He's one of these players when he's there, and I'm searching for a wide receiver in the flex, I'm drafting Jameson Williams a majority of the time. And that's really all I've got in terms of my evaluation of Jameson Williams. Next up, we've got Chris Godwin, who's another player that I've been talking a lot about, who I love at his current ADP. This was the wide receiver 1 in full PPR before he got hurt in week 7 last year against Baltimore. If he did not get hurt last year, we would be talking about Chris Godwin at worst as a second round player in my personal belief. This offense threw the football a ton last year. Baker Mayfield was on fire. We just have him coming off an injury. He could miss the beginning of the season. There's also a lot of reports indicating that he'll be ready week 1. If we get a report that he is ready for week 1, his ADP is going to move up on Undoubtedly, this offense is going to be in the red zone a lot. They're going to score a lot of touchdowns. They're going to throw the football a ton. I love Chris Godwin at his current ADP. Once again, no single-digit fantasy performances last year. Every single game was double-digit fantasy performances. He was balling out before he got hurt. He's a steal in drafts right now. If he wasn't hurt and didn't have the potential to miss the beginning of the season, he'd be ranked higher on this list overall. Next up is George Pickens, another guy who I just love as a flex player, kind of similar to Jameson Williams here. I think there's going to be a lot of high ceilings for Pickens this year. I don't know exactly what the floor is going to look like, but once again, like we talked about with CeeDee Lamb, this passing attack for the Cowboys, it's going to have a lot of volume. Look at the running backs here. Javonte Williams, Jadon Blue, Miles Sanders. It's going to be a throw-first offense, right? And listen, George Pickens in a contract season, whether he's going to get signed with the Cowboys or signed with another team, he's going to have an opportunity to put everything out there on the field. 11.7 fantasy points per game last year, 12.3 the previous season, but this is a different situation for him. Far different offense. Arthur Smith and the Steelers used him in horrendous ways last year. Listen, I do think there could be some bumps in the roads here, but this is what you want out of flex play sometimes. Some boom or bust. George Pickens will deliver on that, and I like him at his current ADP. Next up, we've got Zay Flowers, who historically have been pretty high on Zay Flowers, and I think he's always just fine. And I think I've come to terms that this is a run-first offense, and the volume that goes to Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry on the ground kind of hurts Zay Flowers, to say the least. He's had 12.3 fantasy points or better in his first two seasons, 12.9 in his rookie season, 12.3 last year. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, 116 receiving yards, 74 receptions, wide receiver 25 last year. He's fine. I'm not going out of my way to draft him, but he's fine. He'll probably produce for you. I just don't know what the ceiling is necessarily. You can always trust him as a starter. The floor's safe. That's about it. Next up, we've got DK Metcalf, who I do think could be ranked a little bit higher. I've struggled with my evaluation of Metcalf in the offseason. I've been back and forth here. There are times where I'm like, man, Rodgers really fed Garrett Wilson last year, really fed Devontae Adams. I baked that into my rankings on those guys going to 2025. And then I look at things, I'm like, I just don't know how I feel about this Arthur Smith system under Aaron Rodgers with DK Metcalf as a wide receiver one. Because it does look, you look at things the last 2 years, Metcalf has continuously taken a bit of a step back, going from the wide receiver 16 to the wide receiver 21 to the wide receiver 32 last year, where he had 108 targets, 66 catches, 992 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. So at this point in the offseason, I will say, I think this could change for me. I've been back and forth here. I'm not going to lie to you guys. But at this point in the offseason, this is about where I'm at. He's also gotten progressively worse in fantasy points per game, going from the wide receiver 24 to the wide receiver 22 to the wide receiver 30 in the past 3 years in terms of fantasy points per game. So I'm sorry. He actually improved from 2022 to 2023, but then fell back last year. So at least progressed poorly in the past season, right? So I don't know. I mean, you look at this offense like Jonnu Smith, Pat Freiermuth, Calvin Austin. I don't know. I don't know what to expect here. I don't know where the volume's going to go. It probably will go to Metcalf. So it's a tough one for me. But for me, he's kind of like Zay Flowers. He's just fine. I don't know if the ceiling's super high, but he's fine where he goes in drafts. Next up, we've got Jakobi Meyers, who's one of my favorite options when we bake in his ADP to his overall ranking here. Wide receiver 20 last year in fantasy points per game. Has been a top 30 wide receiver in fantasy points per game in the last 3 seasons, but in a bad offensive system with bad quarterback play, 14.5 fantasy points per game last year, right? I mean, I love where Jakobi Meyers goes in drafts. I think he's criminally underrated. He was the wide receiver 19 last year in full PPR. 129 targets, 87 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns. Brock Bowers is going to get the volume here. I get that. But those numbers we just went over were with Brock Bowers having rookie record numbers, 153 targets, 112 receptions for Bowers. I like Jack Bech. I think Donta Thornton could do something. The run game, we'll see more volume with Ashton Genty. Geno Smith is a big upgrade here for Jakobi Meyers at quarterback, though. So, listen, when we bake in ADP, Meyers is a steal in drafts. He's a player I've talked a lot about this offseason. I think he's appropriately drafted right here. I think he's a solid flex play. I'm not expecting anything crazy here, but I like Meyers a lot as we approach 2025. Next up, we've got Jordan Addison, who by the time this video comes out or by the time you watch it, things might be different here. He is facing a potential 3-game suspension, so maybe that'll move him back in rankings a little bit. But for me, I think that's a good thing. Like right now, he's already a steal in drafts, and I think he'll be an even bigger steal in drafts if he does face an actual suspension. This is a player, once again, I've talked a lot about Addison in the offseason. I love him as a flex option. He missed 2 games last year, then basically didn't play in week 18 either. So basically missed 3 games last year, but at least missed 2 games last year. Was still the wide receiver 21 in full PPR, 9 receiving touchdowns, 99 targets, 63 catches, 875 receiving yards, 14.2 fantasy points per game. And the numbers in his rookie season, wide receiver 23, wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game, right? And he is a red zone target who also gets a lot of down the field throws and targets, and JJ's always on the field, right? So listen, I like Addison a lot. I'm not freaking out about the suspension, and I will say, I think based on his overall potential to get suspended, the ADP here is very, very sneaky for Jordan Addison. Next up, we've got Ted McMillan, and for me, I think Ted McMillan could be higher. I know he goes a lot higher in mock drafts than some of these guys. And I kind of struggled on where to rank him. And I would be perfectly fine if he was like a wide receiver 3 for me, a flex option. He's going to see the volume in this passing game. He fits the mold of like what Bryce Young needs as a wide receiver 1. Early draft capital, best wide receiver in this class. You could definitely argue, not including the Travis Hunter argument, I suppose. But yeah, I like Ted McMillan a lot. I don't know. I just don't find myself in position to draft him a lot, I feel like. And I don't know if I have the confidence at the end of the day to go out and reach for him. But I do like this Dave Canales offensive system. We talked a lot about that last offseason. Bryce Young did show a lot of improvement. It's a pretty good division in terms of like the defenses that the Panthers will be facing this year. So there's a lot to like about Ted McMillan. Maybe he should be ranked higher here. I can admit that, but I still think he's kind of in this bunch of like lower end potential wide receiver 1s who are probably wide receiver 2s for fantasy teams who I would be more comfortable if they are flex options. But I will say he's the one player who I could see definitely scooting up above a lot of the players on today's rankings. Then we got Xavier Worthy, who I really like going into next year. This goes back to kind of what we talked about with Rashee Rice. I think it'll be a good thing when we have Rashee Rice, Worthy, Hollywood, all on the field. I think this offense will be better than last year. Worthy did come on towards the end of the season through the fantasy playoffs. He was one of the best players to have. 19.6 fantasy points, 20.5, 22.9 was productive through the playoffs. I know the Super Bowl, he like had a huge game against backups and people knock him for that, but I think the Chiefs will be able to use Xavier Worthy how they want to and how they drafted him for a little bit more with everyone back and healthy at the receiver position. So I still like Xavier Worthy, still average double-digit fantasy points per game. He's similar to J-Mo for me, where like there's maybe a little bit of a less consistent floor, but the upside will always be there. I like drafting Xavier Worthy for the upside as a flex option as we go into 2025. Let's move on to tier 5. This is going to be lower end flex options. We'll just put it at that. I don't consider these guys anything more than a wide receiver 3 for my fantasy teams, and that's at best. I prefer them as like a second flex or bench option. Now, I was a little bit higher on Jawan Jennings a little bit earlier in the offseason. I still like him, but now we've got the whole contract dispute. It's going to be like this weird fantasy distraction. At least it gives us something to talk about. I don't know what's going to happen here. I would imagine that something gets done here between Jennings and the Niners, but it's just a weird situation. Like Ayuk had the holdout last year. He didn't really perform. Then he got hurt. And then like now we're having this happen with Jennings. I do think Jennings has been plenty productive. Could, deserve a new contract. But, part of my reason for liking Jennings is because we're expecting Ayuk to miss the beginning of the season. But this is a player who I think could present wide receiver 1 value easily at the beginning of the season. Then when Ayuk's back, we still get plenty of good ceiling potential out of Jawan Jennings and probably pretty good floors too. So I think the Niners offense will be better than it was last year. I just don't know if I can depend on Jawan Jennings. And now the contract thing makes things a little bit murky. So plenty of upside here, potential for him to have some very good stretches in the beginning of the season, but ultimately things are a bit shaky. Next up, we've got Jerry Jeudy, and man, earlier in the offseason, I liked Jerry Jeudy a lot more. And my worry about Jerry Jeudy has started to grow because, most concerningly, we don't know like who's the starting quarterback is going to be for the Browns, what this offense is going to look like. We got Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, Dylan Gabriel, Shedeur Sanders, and the ghost of Deshaun Watson on this roster. And listen, at the end of the day, when you look at those big performances in that stretch that Jeudy had, like between weeks 8 and week 17, right? It was mostly Jameis Winston at quarterback and like shootouts and just tossing the football down the field and like those game against Denver and things like that. And I just don't know what we're going to get out of this offense this year. I don't know if that's going to be there. He had a good year last year with over 1,200 receiving yards, 145 targets, 90 catches, 4 receiving touchdowns, was the wide receiver 12 in full PPR. So like with all that baked in, like I'll take shots on Jerry Jeudy at his ADP, but there's a lot of risk associated with drafting Jerry Jeudy, in my opinion. He is like, I would say the only, maybe not the only, but one of the only true wide receiver ones on his team, not for fantasy necessarily, in this tier, but once again, I just don't know what to expect. He's similar to like Chris Olave, who we'll talk about in a minute. So I like Jeudy, but I'm not enough to have him in a higher tier. Next up, we've got Khalil Shakir. I will say at Khalil Shakir's ADP, I like Khalil Shakir. Full PPR, I like him. If you play in any other format, I don't. But in full PPR last year, he gave you double digits in every game he played in, except for 3. The ceiling, not high. The floor, very safe. This offense funnels through Josh Allen, James Cook, the run game, and I do think Cook will be back with the Bills. But I'm not like overly worried about Keon Coleman or Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, Elijah Moore, the other names at wide receiver on this team. I think if anything, Dalton Kincaid and maybe Keon Coleman could be the guys who take some volume here. But Shakir, got awarded with that 4-year extension from Buffalo. I like him a lot. Very good ADP here. And I think he's the true wide receiver 1 for the Bills. But this offense has shown that they don't really funnel through a wide receiver 1, right? So I like him. Good ADP. But the risk is associated because of the way this offense is ran. Next up, we've got Chris Olave. And man, this is another player early in the offseason who, like, I want to be back in on Chris Olave, but in redraft, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm going to be in enough leagues this year. I'm going to have enough best ball entries on Underdog. I'll take shots on everybody on the screen, but once again, this is similar to Jeudy. Who's the quarterback here? Tyler Shuck, Spencer Rattler, the ghost of Taysom Hill. I just don't know, guys, and I'm just not very high on Chris Olave. 2023 was a pretty productive year, was the wide receiver 16 in fantasy, but you bake the concussion concerns into everything, which don't overly scare me. And the fact that he only had 9.6 fantasy points per game last year, I just don't see any real ceiling here. And I'm concerned about the floor. Could be a draft day steal, but I just don't know if I'm all the way in there. And if I trust him as anything more than a bench player at this point in the offseason. Next up, we've got Jayden Reed. I've got Reed a little bit higher than I think most people might. I will take shots on Jayden Reed. That's the main reason I have him higher, and I think that there's upside baked in to Jayden Reed. I do like Matthew Golden. I do think he'll have an impact on this offense, and the Packers went out and drafted him in the first round for a reason, but you also got to think like Romeo Doubs in a contract season, Christian Watson, I don't know if he'll even ever play football again. Like they had a need at wide receiver. Dontavian Wicks could be included here as well in the mix, but Jayden Reed, I still look at things as the wide receiver 1. I think Golden could play like a wide receiver 1, but I think there's going to be a lot of plays drawn up for Jayden Reed, and they didn't really seem to use Jayden Reed to his strengths last year, which was concerning. But wide receiver 29 last year, wide receiver 25 in his rookie season. This is another player who I don't know if the ceiling's high. I think the floor is okay with Jayden Reed, and this is a run-first offense for looking at last year. There is some anticipation that the Packers could throw the football more this year. They did run a lot last year. I think Reed's fine where he's being drafted, and I'll take some shots on him. I think he's one of the players who I like him as like an emergency wide receiver 4 for your roster, but overall a good bench player for your roster. Next up, we've got Stephon Diggs. This is another like true wide receiver 1 for his team as we approach the year, but he's age 31, going into his 11th season, coming off of a major injury, switching to a new team with a sophomore quarterback. If Diggs is healthy, I think he'll have plenty of productive games. I really do. Another player, though, I just don't know what the ceiling's going to look like, and I don't know how safe the floor is, but it is worth noting before the injury last year, he only had 2 single-digit fantasy performances, and he was playing pretty good with the Texans, even with Nico Collins in front of him. So I like Diggs. I think he could be a good security blanket, could have some good red zone looks for Drake May, but ultimately, I don't know. I just don't love the situation here. So he's okay where he goes, and that's about where I'm at. Next up, we've got Roma Dunze. This is probably going to trigger some people because I know there's a lot of Roma Dunze hype and people have him higher. I just don't find myself going out of my way to draft Roma Dunze. And it goes back to what we talked about with DJ Moore. There's just a big unknown here. There's a lot of like hype and anticipation for this offense, and it could go in a very, very positive direction. And don't get me wrong, Roma Dunze, where he goes in drafts, I completely understand taking shots on him. And if you're high on him and the prospect he was, and this could be like a JSN type situation, right? Where the rookie season wasn't that productive and then uber productive in his sophomore season. So I just don't find myself being a guy who's really high on Roma Dunze, and I don't know if I have a great reason for it. It's just something that kind of happens sometimes. So he's okay where he's being drafted, but I think there's reason to draft some of the other players going in front of him, but I think the argument is completely fair if you have the opposite feeling. And then next up, we've got rookie Travis Hunter, and this is just another player I don't find myself drafting a lot of because there's a lot of unknown here. How many snaps he's going to play on offense, how many he's going to play on defense. He's going to be used one way or another because the Jags traded up and used a lot of draft capital on him. Don't get me wrong. So I think that's encouraging. I like Liam Cohen as the head coach. What he did with the Bucs last year as an offensive coordinator. I do think that the reports are indicating he'll play more offense as opposed to defense, at least early in the season. I don't know. Who really knows here? The upside is there. Don't get me wrong. If he didn't play, DB as well, he'd be the wide receiver 1 in this rookie class. Maybe we'd be having a different conversation. I do think there's going to be plenty of plays drawn up for him. And in this Liam Cohen offense, like we talked about with B-Tom, there's enough volume to go around for everybody. So I like Hunter. He's more of like a best ball selection for me. I'm not finding myself drafting a lot of him in redraft. Could be a big mistake. You guys let me know what you think. Last but not least, we've got low-end bench players who could be flex options and might be good flex options, but a lot more risk associated with some of these guys in tier 6. Let's start with Josh Downs, who a player that I'll admit I'm a bit back and forth on. And the big issue with Josh Downs for me is outside of some concerns about staying healthy, at least from what we got last year, is the quarterback play here. I do think the Colts will be better off if Danny Dimes is a starting quarterback. But while Josh Downs has been productive, he also hasn't been that productive. It's a weird feel. There's a lot of inconsistency, but then we also got some pretty good ceilings out of Downs last year. And then we have to admit the quarterback play was all over the place last year. So I'm in on the argument that Downs should have positive regression this year for sure. I'm also worried about this offense in 2025. So was the wide receiver 35 last year, 107 targets, 72 receptions, 803 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, wide receiver 28 in fantasy points per game with 13.1 fantasy points per game. Nothing that bad here. He's certainly not necessarily being drafted as a wide receiver 35, and maybe that's a mistake. I think most people are worried about the potential quarterback play here. So I don't hate Josh Downs. I just don't find myself reaching for him or drafting a ton of him because I'm not very bullish on this Colts passing attack in 2025. But could I see him finishing as close or better than some of the receivers we talked about in tier 5? Sure. But also I think Michael Pittman will be a factor here, and we'll talk about him in a couple minutes. Next up, we've got Brandon Ayuk. This is another player who I just have worries about. I do feel when Ayuk is falling in mocks, he could end up being a really good value, and maybe Jawan Jennings and his status could impact things here. But I also feel like Brandon Ayuk, when he came back last year, he just missed a beat. And I've heard people argue, he skipped training camp and all of that and held out. And then I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter to me. That doesn't make me feel any better because he got hurt in week 8. And there are reports indicating he'll be ready week 1, and there are reports indicating that he won't be ready week 1. He was a wide receiver 15 or better in 2022 and 2023, 2 top 15 finishes. Hard to say. I do think this offense will bounce back next year. I don't know if they'll get back to that status we saw in 2023, 2022, but I do think they'll be better. And I am a Brock Purdy believer. I'm just not very in on Brandon Ayuk right now. I don't have a great feeling. I'm also not in on Jalen Waddle, which is going to trigger somebody for sure. I'm just low on Jalen Waddle. I've been burnt by Waddle, player that I drafted a lot of over the last 3 years. If you guys go back to the OG days of this channel, I am a Jalen Waddle truther early in his career, but dropping from the wide receiver 8 to the wide receiver 34 to the wide receiver 46, progressively getting worse in every metric in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and to a degree games played, has had me a bit worried. And I do think he's tied to Tua Tagovailoa's health as well. I mean, it seems like Hill, Waddle, A-Chain, all these guys are. And I'm not personally overly worried about Tua Tagovailoa's health, but the other thing is like in games where Tua was healthy last year, Jalen Waddle was just not that productive. He had this stretch, weeks 12 through week 14, where he was productive, 28.4 fantasy points, 11.3, 20.9. But ultimately, he was just not productive last year. Week 1 against the Jags was fine, too, with 16.2 fantasy points. And, that was basically the same thing in 2023. He missed a couple games, but he had a tough time staying consistent, and he was at least more consistent in terms of fantasy points per game in 2023. And I don't know. I'm just not in on Waddle. I'm not there. I know it's going to trigger some of you guys. I know people like going out and targeting him. I'm staying away from Jalen Waddle as we approach 2025, but I don't think he's worse than some of the options that you guys will see on the screen coming up here. Next up, we've got Deebo Samuel, who I will say, I think Deebo is a player you guys should consider taking some shots on, which is also going to trigger some people. But listen, I'm just not buying the Deebo is completely like overweight and slow kind of train we have this offseason. I mean, this is another player, like it's hard transitioning from Waddle to Deebo here and trying to make an argument, but I think this offense with the Commanders will be a better fit for him. Listen, if something happens with Terry McLaurin and Deebo's a wide receiver 1, I don't like that situation, but if Terry's back, and I think he will be, and he's the wide receiver 1, I think there's going to be plays drawn up for Deebo Samuel. I think that Cliff Kingsbury is going to be able to use him in unique ways, and like I'm not expecting anything crazy here. Obviously, last year was concerning to look like he missed a beat, to say the least. He still had a couple productive games, but I just think that Deebo, like, there's just been this kind of smear campaign where it's like Deebo's washed. He's fat. He's slow. You can't draft him. If you draft Deebo at all, you're going to lose every fantasy game this year. I still think that this offense was plenty productive last year and had a need for a wide receiver 2, and Deebo is the type of player who can be used in unique ways. So all I'm saying is consider taking some shots on him, and I do think he presents some upside, and baked in at his ADP, very, very cheap draft capital, good bench player, and a good offense. Okay, this offense was plenty productive last year. So I like Deebo to a degree, and I'm probably the only content creator saying that. Next up, we've got Darnell Mooney, who I do really like. I will say, out of all the players in this tier, I probably draft the most of Darnell Mooney. I actually considered having Mooney in tier 5, but he came down a little bit for me at the end of the day. But Mooney is a player who I do think you guys, especially at his ADP, who I have seen Darnell Mooney move up in ADP, but ultimately with Darnell Mooney, I think I should be taking shots on him. He was a wide receiver 34 in fantasy points per game last year, the wide receiver 31 overall in fantasy football PPR last year. 104 targets, 64 catches, 992 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. You're going to get some fluctuation here. You're going to get some ups and downs, but we're expecting better quarterback play out of the Falcons this year, like we talked about with Devontae Adams. Listen, I think Mooney's a great flex player, a great bench player. Should absolutely be taking shots on him in terms of where he's going in drafts at his ADP. So, I don't know. Maybe Mooney should be a little bit higher here, but we'll have to see how things shake out with that new offensive system in Michael Penix's sophomore campaign. Not a new offensive system, but new offensive system because Michael Penix is getting the show in terms of QB1 for the entirety of the year. Anyways, Matthew Golden's up next. I do like Matthew Golden. I think he's worth taking some shots on. We kind of talked about him when we talked about Jaden Reed. These are the two Packers wide receivers I would target the most of. Matthew Golden, speed, fast guy, can be used in unique ways. I've seen comparisons to maybe being used kind of how Xavier Worthy was used with the Chiefs last year. Could see more volume than Reed, could see less. Maybe we still see volume to Romeo Doubs. It's a weird situation. This offense ran the football a ton last year, but they spent high draft capital on Matthew Golden. But once again, they had a need at Matthew Golden. So I don't know if he exactly just moves in right away and is the true wide receiver one here. Once again, I could see plenty of volume to Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and Romeo Doubs, as well as Tucker Kraft, and a lot of volume in the run game as well to Josh Jacobs. So I like Matthew Golden. He's a rookie wide receiver that I think is worth taking shots on, but there's a lot of unknown. Could pay off undoubtedly. Next up, we've got Ricky Pearsall. This is another player. I feel like earlier in the offseason, I was higher on all of the Niners wide receivers than I am at this point in the offseason. He's been dealing with a hamstring issue. I don't think it's going to be an issue. Came on at the end of last year. I don't know what it is. I've just gotten progressively lower on all the Niners wide receivers. I think Jennings presents the most upside. I think Ayuk has the potential to take the most volume once he's back and healthy. I think Pearsall could be a good floor option. His ADP is very fair. I'm a Brock Purdy truther, like I said earlier. Pearsall's fine to me, especially at his ADP, but I don't know if I'm going out of my way to draft him like crazy, but he's perfectly fine. Leave it at that. Michael Pittman, I do think is a slightly disrespected, bit up and down last year, but he was like dealing with a broken back or whatever the entirety of the year, and the quarterback play was awful. So like maybe give him some grace. He was the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game in 2022, the wide receiver 14 fantasy points per game in 2023, dropped to the wide receiver 44 last year, went from the wide receiver 20 in PPR to the wide receiver 13 to the wide receiver 41 in the past 3 seasons, 111 targets, 69 catches, nice, 808 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. I listen, it's the quarterback play that concerns me, just like Josh Downs here. So, I mean, Josh Downs traditionally lines up in 3 wide receiver sets where Michael Pittman is on the field like 100% of the time. So, I think Pittman is a player you should consider drafting more of and not being completely out on. Like all the hype is around Josh Downs, but I think that Pittman could end up being a really good draft day value, especially if Daniel Jones provides stability at the quarterback position. So, if you're in on Danny Dimes, maybe be in on Pittman as well. I do like him at his ADP. Take some shots on him, but he's still a bench player for me. Next up, we got Cooper Kupp. Kupp is an interesting read. Like people act like Cooper Kupp had the worst season of all time last year, and it was disappointing. Sure, was the wide receiver 38 in full PPR through 12 games, the wide receiver 19 in fantasy points per game. But he still had some pretty dang good fantasy performances last year. It was just really bad through the fantasy playoffs. 5 single-digit fantasy performances last year. Every other game, double-digit fantasy performances. 0 points in Week 15. 5.4 in Week 16. 3.9 in Week 17. So the fall-off was drastic at the worst time of the fantasy season that he could potentially have had, right? I think that's baked into a lot of people's memories, but I do think that Kupp can be productive in this offense. But I think that first and foremost, as we talked about earlier, the heartbeat of the passing attack is Jackson Smith and Jigba. And this will be a run-first offense under this new system, new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak, right? So I think that concerns me a bit for Kupp. Outside of everything else, he's age 32 going into his 9th season, has been dealing with injuries for the last 3 seasons. So Kupp, upside low, but the floor could definitely be there. And you go back, look at what he did last year. It was bad at the wrong times, but ultimately it wasn't that bad, I think. I don't know. You guys tell me. Last but not least, Christian Kirk, my guy, had to make the list. Christian Kirk, I think, is worth taking some shots on. This is another veteran-esque player, age 28, going into his 8th season, coming off of 2 injury-prone seasons. But the Texans have a need at wide receiver. They did address that in the draft as well. Not necessarily with the earliest possible draft capital, but they did draft 2 wide receivers. And I think that Christian Kirk could come in here and be a really good slot receiver for the Texans and be a very solid security blanket. Have a good floor. I don't think the upside's high here, but the Texans have a need at the wide receiver position. So at least behind Nico Collins, I should say. Right. I like Christian Kirk. Take some shots on him. Nothing more than a bench player. Could have a very solid role with the Texans. We'll leave it at that. That's my wide receiver 50 as we approach 2025 fantasy football. That'll do it for today's video. There are my top 50 wide receivers as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft dynasty, and best ball. Please consider hitting that subscribe button on the way out if you guys are into that. If you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop them in the comments down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. If you guys want to check out any of our other content for the upcoming 2025 fantasy football season, we're putting out free daily fantasy football content to help you guys prepare. Those will be popping up on these two playlists at any moment here. You guys can check out some of those videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.